Let me tell you a story. A canary sits in a cage, gazing through the bars. And year after year, it watches the world outside and it dreams. And then one morning, it notices that the cage door it's open, it's ajar. And so the canary catches its breath and it waits to see when's it going to close. And eventually he decides, okay, he hops onto the edge of the door and he pops out of the cage. And he flies around the room a bit, and then he sits on the back of the couch and he perches on the bookshelf and he looks out the window. And then an hour later or so, the canary goes back into the cage. And he goes back to gazing through the bars, dreaming. The door is still open. So is the window beyond. But that's where he stays. Because freedom's not easy. But security and comfort and familiarity, they are. A long time ago, long before I had the habit of drawing, my mother and my sister chipped in and they rented me a studio for a month, a painting studio. And it was the most terrifying gift that I'd ever received. I went down to DeBross Street in Tribeca, New York, and I walked into the studio. Mine, all mine. I cackled under my breath, but, well, I was terrified. This room was about 15 feet square, and it was completely empty. So I took out a pad and a piece of charcoal, and I sat there for a while, and then I wrote about how I felt having this studio all of my own. And I filled several pages with writing and charcoal on these big sheets, and I taped them to the wall. And then I left. I came back a week or so later, and I made a little collage from cut up pieces of a magazine. And I taped that to the wall, and I left. And a week after that, I drew colored lines on those collages with a highlighter marker. Finally, the last week in the studio, my month was almost up. So I brought in a photo of my grandfather, and I brought this giant canvas. And I painted this terrible copy of that portrait onto the canvas. And at the end of the day, I left. And I left the canvas and the collage and the charcoal writing in the studio. I locked the door, and I never came back. A few years later, I quit my advertising career and I moved to Los Angeles. And I planned to work in the spare bedroom and to sit at a little desk in the corner and to write my new book. And then I saw our 2-car garage, about 300 or so square feet of emptiness. And like the garage, I stood there with my mouth wide open. I couldn't believe it. I spent the first week filling it with tables and shelves and cubby holes, and I spent the second week sitting at my desk, writing my new book and rearranging bottles of ink. Every so often I would draw in my journal. I'd use a fountain pen and a white pencil. And I spent the third week just thinking. And I realized that I had managed to perfectly reproduce the layout of my office back in the ad agency in New York. I had a lamp and a rug and a laptop and a phone and a box of thumbtacks. I ate lunch at my desk. I surfed the web. I was even filling my calendar with a record of my daily doings, just in case I had to fill in timesheets at the end of the month. All that was missing were a couple of account executives and a client. So I went to the art supply store and I bought whatever I wanted. At first, that wasn't much. It was just a few tiny pallets for gouache and a bottle of ink. Oh, and a block of 14x7 mixed media paper. Well, back in my empty garage, I opened the pad and I did a sort of a tentative self-portrait in ink. I was breaking one of my cardinal agreements with myself with a simple act. I was making a drawing with no writing that wasn't in a sketchbook. I mean, those had been my rules. And small wonder that the self-portrait looked like I'd just eaten something bad. Then I did a gouache painting on that block, and I pinned it up next to the self-portrait. And then in a sort of fit of pique, I got a house paintbrush and I dipped it in ink and I drew this giant painting of my dog Tim on the back of an empty IKEA box. I felt slightly winded and somewhat nauseous. And I took out my journal and I told my journal what I had just done. I revealed my betrayal of my rules about keeping a sketchbook and my sort of weird fuzzy feelings about it. And then the next day I went out and I bought a 64 box of Crayolas. And I bought some tempera and I did a wax resist portrait. And then I did some more gouache paintings and then a painting of the house in poster paints on cardboard. And before long, I had filled the garage and all of its walls with work. The following week, I sat on the corner of my street holding the fattest Sharpie I could find, and I drew the house across the intersection on this giant sheet of cardboard. And when I'd filled that whole board, I went back to the garage and I got another piece of cardboard and I continued the drawing. This big, grubby, sort of dog-eared diptych. The next day, I continued the drawing, working my way down the street. And when it was done, it was 11 and a half feet wide. And then I added gouache and I created this cheerful portrait of another glorious day in my new neighborhood. Just like the California sunshine had transformed my hero David Hockney, I felt this call to use candy colors and bold lines and to work as big as all outdoors. If you're getting a little set in your ways, check out the door of your cage. The world is wide and it's a little terrifying, but it's wonderful out there. You don't have to chuck your job, you don't have to move out of your home, you don't have to give up your safety, all the rest. Just try out your wings and enjoy the view. Are you ready? Hey, the idea for this video started with one of the essays that I write every week. I write them just to send out to people who subscribe, and they're free. And I do it for the same reason that I make these YouTube videos, because I get ideas and I really want to share them with you. And you can get these essays too if you'd like. Just go to dannysessays.com and tell me where you want to get them. And I'll start sending them off to you. Thanks. I hope this was useful, and I look forward to sending you an essay.